I watched from the kitchen doorway as Mom slid the envelope across the dining table to Clarissa, my stepsister, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the paper with theatrical finality. "It's all there," Mom said, her voice dripping with that saccharine sweetness she reserved for her biological daughter. $65,000, everything your father and I saved for college. Clarissa squealed, bouncing in her chair like a child half her 18 years. "Oh my God, Mom! This is perfect! Stanford is going to be amazing!" My father sat at the head of the table, not meeting my eyes. He hadn't met my eyes in 3 days, not since I'd told them I'd been accepted to Yale, not since Mom had informed me with cold efficiency that there would be no money for my education. "What about Emma?" Dad finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mom's laugh was sharp, cutting. "Emma can take out loans like everyone else. Or maybe community college would be more her speed anyway. It's not like Yale was a real acceptance, probably some diversity quota they needed to fill." The words should have cut. In my previous life, they had destroyed me. I'd stood in this exact spot 17 years ago, tears streaming down my face, watching my college fund, the money my biological mother had set aside before she died when I was 6, being handed to Clarissa like a gift, wrapped in betrayal. But I wasn't that Emma anymore. I died at 35, bitter and broken, crushed under the weight of student debt I'd accumulated for a degree I'd eventually dropped out of after one semester because I couldn't afford to continue. I'd died in a studio apartment that smelled of mold, estranged from the family that had never wanted me, working a job that barely covered rent. My last thought had been regret. Regret that I'd never fought back, never stood up for myself, never made them pay for what they'd stolen from me. Then I'd woken up in my 18-year-old body, 3 weeks before high school graduation, with 17 years of memories burning in my mind like lessons carved in fire. This time would be different. "That's fine," I said from the doorway, my voice steady. "I don't need the money." All three of them turned to stare at me. Mom's eyes narrowed with suspicion. Dad looked relieved and guilty in equal measure. Clarissa's expression was pure confusion. She'd expected tears, dramatics, a scene she could later describe to her friends as evidence of my instability. "What do you mean you don't need it?" Mom asked slowly. I shrugged, pushing off from the doorframe. "I mean exactly that. Give it all to Clarissa. She clearly needs it more than I do." The confusion on their faces was delicious. I'd planned this moment for 3 weeks, ever since I'd woken up in my teenage body and realized I'd been given a second chance. In my first life, I'd fought, screamed, and begged. I'd called my grandparents, my mother's parents, who'd been frozen out by Dad and his new wife in desperation, but they'd been traveling in Europe, and by the time they'd returned and understood what had happened, I'd already dropped out of school, already started the slow spiral that would define my wasted first life. This time, I'd called them the day after I woke up. I'd called them and told them everything. About the will my mother had left, about how Dad had allowed his new wife to access the trust that was supposed to be mine, about how they were planning to give it all to Clarissa. My grandmother had wept on the phone. My grandfather had gone very, very quiet. "We'll handle this," he'd said. "But Emma, don't let them know we're involved. Can you do that?" I absolutely could. My grandparents were Richard and Patricia Caldwell, names that carried weight in academic and business circles. In my previous life, I'd been too proud and too hurt to maintain a relationship with them after everything fell apart. And they died when I was 23, leaving their fortune to various charities, since I'd refused to have anything to do with family anymore. This time, I'd swallowed my pride and my pain, and I'd learned that they'd been trying to reach me for years in that other life. Letters intercepted by Mom, calls unreturned because I'd been too devastated to trust anyone. "Are you being sarcastic?" Clarissa asked, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't stupid, just spoiled. She could sense something was off. "Not at all," I said pleasantly. "You deserve every penny. After all, you worked so hard for that Stanford acceptance." The barb was subtle enough that Dad missed it, but Mom's jaw tightened. She knew exactly how Clarissa had gotten into Stanford, through a generous donation from Dad's business partner, whose daughter was Clarissa's best friend. Nothing illegal, just the kind of advantage money could buy. Clarissa's grades were mediocre, her test scores worse, but she'd written an essay about overcoming adversity that Mom had actually written for her. My Yale acceptance, on the other hand, had been earned through 4 years of perfect grades, science fair victories, debate championships, and volunteer work that I genuinely cared about. In my previous life, I'd thought it would matter. I'd thought achievement would earn love, respect, a place at this table. I'd been so stupidly wrong. Well, Mom said, recovering quickly, she always did. I'm glad you're being mature about this, Emma. It shows real growth. Absolutely, Bun, I agreed. In fact, I think this calls for a celebration. Clarissa's going to Stanford. That's huge. Clarissa beamed, suspicion melting into narcissistic pleasure. She'd always been easy to manipulate with praise. Over the next 2 weeks, I played my role perfectly. I congratulated Clarissa at every opportunity. I helped her shop for dorm supplies, using the money from my part-time job at the library. I smiled at family dinners when Mom would make pointed comments about realistic expectations and the value of state schools. I nodded sympathetically when Dad would awkwardly try to give me career advice that always ended with, "Not everyone is cut out for Ivy League pressure." I watched Clarissa deposit the check, my mother's money, the money that should have been mine, into her account. I watched her buy a new laptop, new clothes, a new car. Small, really, compared to what she'd spend on Stanford's tuition, but each purchase was another brick in the wall I was building. And through it all, I waited. The call came 3 days before graduation. I was in my room, supposedly working on my valedictorian speech, another honor that Mom had tried to get overturned, claiming my GPA must have been calculated wrong, when I heard the phone ring downstairs. Then Mom's voice, sharp with surprise. "Patricia, we didn't expect to hear from you." I crept to the top of the stairs, listening. "Yes, Emma is here." "No, we've been very supportive of her education." "I don't know what she might have told you, but..." "What do you mean you want to see the trust documents?" "Robert set that up years ago. It's all perfectly legal. The money was for college expenses, and we decided that..." "Patricia, you're being unreasonable. Your daughter died 12 years ago. Robert moved on. He has a new family now, and we have to make decisions that are best for everyone." The conversation deteriorated from there. I listened to Mom try to justify, to explain, to manipulate. I heard my grandfather's voice, distant but firm through the phone. I heard Mom's voice rise, then crack with something that might have been fear. When she hung up, I heard her immediately call someone. My father, probably at his office. "We have a problem," she hissed into the phone. "Emma's grandparents are back, and they're asking questions about the trust. You told me that money was yours to manage. You told me it was part of the marital assets. If they get lawyers involved, Robert, if they audit the accounts..." "We used some of it for the house renovations. We used it for Clarissa's private school tuition. If they can prove we misappropriated funds meant for Emma..." I smiled in the darkness at the top of the stairs. My grandparents' lawyers were very, very good. It took 3 days for the full audit, 3 days during which Mom became increasingly frantic, Dad increasingly absent, and Clarissa increasingly confused about why her mother was suddenly drinking wine at lunch and snapping at everyone. I maintained my serene facade. I went to graduation practice. I helped Clarissa pack for Stanford. I pretended not to notice the tension crackling through the house like electricity before a storm. The explosion came the day after graduation. I'd given my valedictorian speech, a careful meditation on the importance of integrity and the value of earned achievements, and managed not to look at my family in the third row as I spoke. My grandparents had flown in for the ceremony, sitting in the back, and I'd met their eyes once, just once, and seen pride there that made my throat tight. The next morning, 2 lawyers arrived at our house at 8 a.m. Mom answered the door in her bathrobe, her face haggard. The lawyers were polite but implacable. They had documents, they had questions, they had proof that the trust fund my mother had established, worth significantly more than $65,000 thanks to careful investment over 12 years, had been systematically drained by my father and stepmother for personal expenses that had nothing to do with my education. "The house renovations in 2019, one lawyer said, her voice crisp. $40,000 from the trust. The European vacation in 2020, $35,000. Clarissa's private school tuition from 2018 to 2022, $96,000. The new car purchased last year, $42,000. Should I continue? Dad had come home from the office. He sat on the couch, his face gray. I didn't know, he said weakly. Margaret handled the finances. I thought it was all legal. You thought you could steal from your daughter and no one would notice, my grandfather said from the doorway. I hadn't even known he'd arrived, but suddenly he was there, tall and imposing in his suit, my grandmother beside him. You thought because we were out of the country, because Emma was young, because your wife was clever, that you could take what my daughter left for her child and use it to fund your new family's lifestyle. It wasn't like that, Mom said. But her voice was thin, desperate. We were going to pay it back. You were going to give away the remainder to Clarissa, Grandmother said coldly, ma'am. You told Emma 3 weeks ago that there was no money for her education, that she'd have to take loans while you handed what was left to a girl who has no legal or moral claim to those funds. Clarissa, who'd been standing in the corner in her pajamas, made a small sound. Mom, what are they talking about? You said that money was from you and Dad. You said it was for me. It was supposed to be, Mom snapped, then seemed to realize what she'd admitted. I mean, we thought. The lawyers let them spiral. They were good at their jobs. They laid out every transaction, every withdrawal, every lie. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that my father and stepmother had committed embezzlement, fraud, and breach of fiduciary duty. The trust had been worth over $400,000. They'd spent more than half of it. We're prepared to pursue criminal charges, Grandfather said, unless restitution is made immediately. We don't have that kind of money, Dad said. His hands were shaking. The business is leveraged. The house has a mortgage. We can't just... Then you'll sell the house, Grandmother said calmly. You'll liquidate your assets. You'll take loans against the business. You'll do whatever is necessary to return what you stole from our granddaughter. That's not fair, Clarissa cried. What about Stanford? What about my college fund? You never had a college fund, dear, Grandmother said, not unkindly. You had a stepfather foolish enough to steal from his daughter to buy your mother's affection. That's not the same thing. I stood against the wall, watching it all unfold. In my previous life, I would have felt guilt, maybe even sympathy. I would have been the one trying to smooth things over, to find compromise, to sacrifice my needs for family peace. Not anymore. Emma, Dad said, turning to me with pleading eyes. You can't want this. We're your family. We made mistakes, but we can work this out. Tell them you don't want to destroy us. I looked at him for a long moment. At this man who'd been my hero once, who I'd loved desperately, who'd remarried 2 years after my mother died, and slowly, gradually, let his new wife erase me from his life. You're right, I said quietly. We are family, and family shouldn't steal from each other. Family shouldn't lie. Family shouldn't make one child feel worthless, so another child can feel special. You taught me that, Dad. You and Mom taught me exactly what family means. His face crumpled. The house went on the market that week. Dad took out a second mortgage on the business and maxed out every line of credit he had. Mom's jewelry, expensive pieces Dad had bought her with what I now knew was partially my money, was sold. Clarissa's new car was returned to the dealership. By the end of June, my trust fund had been restored, with interest and penalties. The final amount was $560,000. I didn't need it for Yale. That was the beautiful irony. The perfect revenge that I'd been building toward since the moment I'd woken up in my second chance at life. 2 days after I'd called my grandparents, back in those first weeks after my rebirth, I'd received a call from Yale's admissions office. A different call than in my first life. In that first life, I'd been accepted, but with no financial aid. My family's income was too high, but they'd claimed they couldn't contribute, and I'd been left with the choice of massive debt or walking away. This time, when the admissions counselor called, she'd sounded excited. Emma, we've been reviewing your application again, and we'd like to offer you a place in our Presidential Scholars Program. It's a full scholarship, tuition, room, board, and a stipend for expenses. Your work in the sciences, particularly your research on environmental contamination in local water supplies, caught the attention of our environmental studies department. They're actually interested in continuing that research at the university level. Would you be interested? I'd almost dropped the phone. In my first life, I'd done that research project for a local science fair, but I'd rushed it, stressed about college applications and dealing with my family's drama. It had won third place locally, and I'd forgotten about it. This time, with the knowledge from my first life, I'd known which approaches would work. I'd refined my methodology. I'd reached out to professors at local universities for advice. I'd turned a good project into an exceptional one. It had won the state science fair and attracted media attention for exposing dangerous contamination levels in 3 neighboring towns. I hadn't done it for Yale. I'd done it because in my first life, people had gotten sick from that water, and nothing had been done about it until years later. I'd done it because I'd had the chance to fix something real, something important, and this time I'd taken it. Yale had noticed. Yes, I told the counselor, my voice shaking. Yes, I'm very interested. Wonderful, we'll be sending out the formal offer letter soon. And Emma, congratulations, we're lucky to have you. I hadn't told my family. When the Yale acceptance letter arrived, the regular one, the one without the scholarship information, I'd let them think it was just an acceptance, an impossible dream I couldn't afford. I'd watched Mom sneer about Ivy League pretension. I'd watched Dad look guilty but say nothing. I'd watched Clarissa pity me. And I'd said nothing about the second letter, the one that came to my grandparents' address, the one that outlined the full presidential scholarship. The day after the trust fund was restored, I told them. We were in the kitchen, the same kitchen where this had all started. Mom was on her phone, probably looking at apartments. They'd have to move once the house sold. Dad was going through bills, his face aged 10 years in a few weeks. Clarissa was crying again, as she'd been doing a lot lately, mourning her lost Stanford dreams. I need to tell you something, I said. Mom looked up, her expression wary. In the past weeks, she'd tried various approaches with me: anger, guilt, bargaining, playing the victim. Nothing had worked. I'd remained polite, distant, untouchable. I'm going to Yale, I said. I got a full scholarship, presidential scholar program, everything paid for, tuition, room, board, research stipend. I found out 3 weeks ago. The silence was profound. 3 weeks, Dad repeated slowly. You knew 3 weeks ago. Yes. Before we gave Clarissa the money, Mom said, her voice sharp with realization. You knew you didn't need it, and you said nothing. You set us up. No, I corrected. You set yourselves up. I just didn't stop you from taking the rope you were already reaching for. You vindictive little, Mom started, but Clarissa cut her off. You could have told us, Clarissa said, her voice breaking. I could have kept the money. I could have gone to Stanford. Why didn't you just tell us? I looked at my stepsister, this girl I'd tried so hard to love in my first life. This girl who'd accepted every advantage given to her without ever questioning where it came from. Because you needed to learn what it feels like, I said simply. To have something taken away, to watch someone else get what should have been yours, to be told that your dreams don't matter as much as someone else's comfort. You needed to know how that feels. That's cruel, Dad whispered. Yes, I agreed. But it is. Just like what you did to me was cruel. The difference is, what I did was justice. What you did was just cruelty. I left for my grandparents' house that afternoon. I'd been living there, really, storing my things there, sleeping there most nights. The house with Dad and Mom had stopped being home a long time ago, in my first life, if not in this one. Over the summer, I watched from a distance as my former family's life continued to unravel. The house sold, but for less than they'd hoped. The market was bad, and they'd been desperate. They moved into a small condo in a worse part of town. Dad's business partner, the one who'd helped get Clarissa into Stanford, withdrew from the partnership when the financial irregularities came to light. Nothing illegal, but enough to make the relationship untenable. Mom got a job, a real job, for the first time in 12 years, working retail at a department store. I heard from mutual acquaintances that she hated it, that she complained constantly about standing all day, about rude customers, about the humiliation of wearing a name tag. Clarissa enrolled in community college. She'd tried to defer her Stanford acceptance for a year, hoping the money situation would improve, but Stanford had quietly rescinded the offer when certain details about her application, specifically who had written her essays, came to light. Apparently, my grandmother's lawyers had been very thorough in their investigation, and Stanford had not appreciated being deceived. Dad aged. That was the best way to describe it. The man who'd been fit and confident at 53 looked haggard and old by 54. He didn't call me. I didn't call him. I felt nothing watching them struggle. That was the strangest part. I'd expected guilt, or at least some complicated mix of satisfaction and sadness. Instead, I felt peaceful, calm, like a debt had been paid and accounts were finally balanced. In late July, my grandparents threw me a going-away party. It was small, some family friends, a few of my teachers from high school, my best friend Jen, who was going to Berkeley and who'd been the only person to ask if I was really okay through all of this. "You're different," Jen had said to me one night, a few weeks after graduation. "I can't explain it. You're still you, but you're harder somehow. More sure of yourself." "Maybe I just finally figured out who I am," I'd said. "And who's that?" "Someone who doesn't set herself on fire to keep other people warm." At the party, my grandmother stood up to give a toast. She was 73, elegant, intelligent, and she had her daughter's eyes, my mother's eyes, my eyes. "To Emma," she said, raising her glass, "who survived what she shouldn't have had to survive and who came out stronger. Your mother would be so proud of you. We are so proud of you." I cried then for the first time since I'd woken up in this second life. Not sad tears, but tears of relief, of release, of being finally seen and valued. "Thank you," I managed. "For everything, for believing me, for helping me." "You helped yourself," Grandfather said gruffly. "We just provided the tools. You were the one brave enough to use them." The week before I left for Yale, I did something I hadn't planned to do. I stopped by the condo where my former family now lived. Mom answered the door. She looked tired, older. Her hands were rough from work. "Emma," she said, her voice neutral, "I didn't expect to see you." "I'm leaving for school soon," I said. "I wanted to say goodbye." She laughed, a bitter sound. "Goodbye, that's appropriate. I assume we won't be hearing from you." "Probably not," I agreed. "But I wanted you to understand something. I didn't do this because I hate you." "No?" Her voice was sharp. "Then why?" "Because you needed to face consequences," I said. "Because in a just world, people who hurt children, especially their own children, don't get to just walk away. They have to answer for it. And because I needed to prove to myself that I wasn't going to spend another life being a victim." "Another life?" Mom frowned. "Never mind," I said. "Is Clarissa here?" "She's at work. She got a job at a coffee shop." "Good," I said. "Work is good for people. It builds character." Mom's jaw tightened. "You know what? You're right. I was cruel to you. I was jealous of your mother, of the pedestal Robert put her on after she died, of the perfect wife I could never measure up to, and you were a reminder of her every day. So, yes, I pushed you aside. I favored my daughter. I took what wasn't mine, and now I'm paying for it." She stepped closer. "But you want to know what I think? I think you're going to have a very lonely life, Emma, because people who keep score the way you do, who plan revenge as carefully as you did, they don't have real relationships. They don't trust anyone. You'll be successful, probably. Rich, certainly, with your grandparents' money, but you'll be alone." I smiled. "Maybe," I said. "But I'll be alone on my own terms, not because someone convinced me I didn't deserve better. And that's the difference between us, Margaret. You spent your life trying to take from others. I'm going to spend mine building something real." I turned to leave, then paused. "Oh, and one more thing. I'm setting up a scholarship fund with part of my trust money. For students from broken homes, kids who've been abused or neglected by their families. I'm calling it the Sarah Caldwell Memorial Scholarship, after my mother. I thought you should know that. Something good is coming from all of this." I didn't wait for her response. I walked back to my car, got in, and drove away. I arrived at Yale in late August to a campus that was exactly as beautiful as I'd imagined. My room in the residential college was small, but mine, genuinely mine, paid for with money that no one could take away. My roommate was a girl named Priya from Boston, pre-med, funny and kind. We bonded over late-night pizza and mutual confusion over our chemistry syllabus. I made friends in my residential college, in my classes, in the lab where I continued my water contamination research under a professor who treated me like a colleague rather than a student. I joined clubs, I went to parties. I studied hard but not desperately because I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I'd already proven everything I needed to prove. In October, I got an email from my father. It was long, rambling, full of apologies and excuses. He wanted to reconcile. He wanted me to understand. He wanted forgiveness. I read it twice, then deleted it. Maybe someday I'd be ready for that conversation. Maybe someday I'd be able to forgive or at least forget, but not now. Not when I was finally free. By December, I'd made Dean's List. By spring, I'd presented my research at a national environmental science conference, and a major nonprofit had expressed interest in funding an expansion of my work. By the end of freshman year, I'd been invited to join a prestigious research lab for the summer, working on groundwater contamination across multiple states. My grandparents visited for Parents' Weekend. We had dinner at a nice restaurant off campus, and grandmother cried when I showed her my grades, my research awards, the article about my work that had appeared in the campus newspaper. "Your mother would be so proud," she said again. "I know," I said. "I'm proud too." In my second year, I started dating someone, a grad student named Marcus, who was getting his PhD in environmental policy. He was kind, brilliant, passionate about the same issues I cared about. When I told him, slowly, carefully, about my family situation, he just listened, then said, "That must have been incredibly hard. I'm glad you got away." Not pity, not horror, just understanding and acceptance. I thought about Mom's prediction that I'd be alone. Looking around my life, at Priya and my other friends, at Marcus, at my research team, at my grandparents who called weekly, I realized how wrong she'd been. I wasn't alone. I was surrounded by people who'd earned their place in my life and who valued me in return. That was what real relationships looked like. Not obligation, not guilt, not transactions, but genuine mutual respect and care. Junior year, Clarissa sent me a Facebook message. It was short. "I'm sorry for everything. I didn't understand. I hope you're doing well." I stared at it for a long time. I thought about responding, about asking what had changed, about maybe, possibly, trying to build some kind of relationship with this girl who was technically still my stepsister. In the end, I just replied, "Thank you. I hope you're doing well too." And that was enough. Maybe someday there would be more. But I didn't need more. I didn't need her guilt or her apology to feel complete. Senior year, I was accepted to Yale's doctoral program with full funding. My undergraduate research had expanded into a comprehensive study of contamination patterns in post-industrial communities, and I'd co-authored 3 papers that had been published in major journals. I'd also secured a grant to continue my work, enough to fund not just my research, but to hire undergraduate research assistants. At my graduation, my grandparents sat in the front row. Priya's parents were next to them. We'd become so close that our families had bonded too. Marcus was there, having finished his PhD and accepted a position at an environmental think tank in DC. He'd asked me to move with him after I finished my doctorate, and I'd said yes. Jen flew in from California, where she was working at a tech startup. My favorite professors were there. The friends I'd made, the community I'd built. My father wasn't there. Mom wasn't there. Clarissa wasn't there. I hadn't invited them. They hadn't asked to come. As I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, I thought about my first life. That Emma who'd died at 35, broken and bitter. That Emma who'd let herself be ground down by people who'd never valued her. That Emma who'd given up. I thought about the moment I'd woken up in my 18-year-old body, given a chance I didn't deserve but had seized anyway. And I thought about what I'd learned, that revenge isn't always about destruction. Sometimes revenge is just living well. Sometimes revenge is refusing to let the people who hurt you define your story. Sometimes revenge is simply surviving, thriving, and building a life so full and rich that the past becomes just a distant memory. That night, at dinner with everyone I loved, my grandmother raised her glass. To Emma, she said, who took every terrible thing that happened to her and turned it into something beautiful. To Emma, everyone echoed. I looked around the table at these people who'd chosen me, who I'd chosen in return. I thought about the scholarship fund that was now helping 15 students escape their own difficult situations. I thought about the research that was making real differences in real communities. I thought about Marcus, about the future we were planning, about the life I was building brick by brick, and I thought, this is what victory looks like. Not my family's destruction, though that had been necessary. Not even my success, though that was sweet. Victory was this, the absolute certainty that I'd made the right choice, that I'd fought back, that I'd refused to be a victim, that I'd taken my pain and transformed it into purpose. Victory was knowing that in a different life, a first life, I'd died with regrets. In this life, I'd have none. Years later, when I was 35, the age I'd been when I died in that first life, I thought about writing down my story. Not for publication, but for me. A record of what I'd been through, what I'd overcome, what I'd learned. I was living in D.C. by then. Marcus and I had married 3 years earlier in a small ceremony at my grandparents' house. I had my doctorate. I was directing my own environmental research institute, funded by a combination of grants, donations, and support from people who believed in the work. The water contamination research I'd started in high school had grown into a national database of contamination sites, a policy advocacy organization, and direct intervention programs in affected communities. We'd helped clean up dozens of sites. We'd changed regulations. We'd saved lives. I'd published a book about environmental justice that had won several awards. I'd testified before Congress, I'd been interviewed on national news programs, and through it all, I'd maintained the Sarah Caldwell Memorial Scholarship, which had grown from helping 15 students to helping over 100 each year. My life was full, rich, purposeful. I heard about my father occasionally through mutual acquaintances. He'd retired early from his business, which had never recovered from the loss of his partner. He and Mom were still together, still in that small condo. Clarissa had finished her associate's degree and was working as a dental hygienist. She'd married, had a child, they were fine. Not thriving, but surviving. Ordinary lives, which was perhaps its own kind of punishment for people who'd once felt entitled to extraordinary things taken from others. I felt nothing when I heard these updates. Not satisfaction, not vindication, not even curiosity. They were just people I used to know, like high school classmates you'd lost touch with. The past was past. On my 35th birthday, Marcus threw me a surprise party. Our house was full of friends, colleagues, students I'd mentored. My grandparents were there, older now, but still sharp, still proud. Priya had flown in from Seattle, where she was a pediatrician. Jen came from San Francisco with her wife and new baby. "Speech!" someone called out, and others took up the chant. I laughed, holding up my hands. Okay, I'm not good at speeches. Liar, Marcus said, grinning. You've testified before Congress. That's different, I protested, but I stood up anyway. I looked around at all these faces, these people who'd chosen to celebrate with me. And I thought about the girl I'd been at 18, standing in a kitchen, watching her college fund being given away. I thought about the woman I'd been at 35 in another life, dying alone and broken. I used to think, I said slowly, that the worst thing that could happen to a person was to be betrayed by their family, to be treated as worthless by the people who were supposed to love you most. The room had gone quiet. And maybe that is the worst thing, or one of them. It's certainly painful. It certainly leaves scars. I paused. But I learned something important. I learned that family isn't just who you're born to. Family is who shows up for you, who believes in you, who celebrates your victories and helps you through your defeats. I looked at my grandparents, at Marcus, at Priya and Jen, and all the others. You're my family, I said. All of you, and I'm grateful every single day that I found you or that you found me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being you. To family, someone called out. To family, everyone echoed. Later that night, after everyone had gone home and Marcus and I were cleaning up, he asked, "Do you ever regret it? The way things happened with your dad and stepmom?" I thought about it carefully. No, I said finally. I regret that it had to happen at all. I regret that they were the kind of people who would steal from their own child, but I don't regret standing up for myself. I don't regret fighting back, and I don't regret building this life instead of the one they wanted me to have. What life did they want you to have? A small one, I said. A life where I was grateful for scraps, where I understood my place, where I never challenged them or made them feel guilty or succeeded too much. I shook my head. They wanted me to be small so they could feel big. Instead, you became extraordinary, Marcus said. No, I corrected. I became myself, that's all. But myself was never going to be small, no matter how hard they tried to make me that way. He kissed me then, and I thought about how lucky I was. Not lucky because I'd been given a second chance at life, though that was miracle enough. Lucky because I'd had the courage to use that chance. Lucky because I'd fought back instead of giving in. Lucky because I'd chosen to build instead of just destroy. That night, I had a dream. Not a nightmare, not a memory, but something peaceful. I dreamed of my mother, Sarah Caldwell, who I barely remembered from my first life and didn't remember at all from this one. I'd been too young when she died. She was sitting in a garden and she was smiling. "I'm proud of you," she said. "For the revenge?" I asked. She laughed. "For the living. The revenge was just you making space for the living. You did good, baby. You did so good." I woke up with tears on my face, but they weren't sad tears. They were grateful ones. Because in the end, that was the real victory. Not that I'd made my father and stepmother pay for what they'd done. Not even that I'd built this successful, meaningful life. The victory was that I'd survived. I'd survived, and I'd transformed survival into something beautiful. I'd taken the worst thing that ever happened to me and used it as fuel to become the person I was always meant to be. That was revenge in its purest form. Becoming so fully, completely yourself that the people who tried to diminish you become irrelevant. That was victory in its truest sense. Building a life so good, so full, so rich that the past loses its power over you. And that was grace. Knowing I'd been given a second chance and making absolutely sure I didn't waste it. I got out of bed, careful not to wake Marcus, and went to my office. I pulled out a journal, the one I'd been keeping since I woke up in my 18-year-old body, and I wrote, "Today I am 35 years old. In another life, I died today. In this life, I'm just getting started. I let them give her my college fund. I let them think they'd won. And then I built an empire from the ashes of their betrayal. Yale had already given me a scholarship, but more than that, I'd already given myself permission to be extraordinary. That was the real gift. Not the second chance. Not even the revenge. The gift was learning that I was never the small, worthless thing they tried to make me believe I was. The gift was learning that I was always enough, always worthy, always capable of extraordinary things. The gift was learning that the only person who could truly defeat me was myself, and I would never, never let that happen again. I closed the journal and looked out the window at the DC skyline, at the city where I'd built my career, my life, my future, and I smiled. Because this, all of this, was mine. Earned, built, deserved, and no one could ever take it away.